So first of all, thank you very much for having me here at your conference virtually. Unfortunately, didn't come physically. It's a great pleasure to be here and to give a 7 minutes introductory presentation on the Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan, the so-called BEMIP high-level group. If you can go to the next slide, which is one of 4 high-level groups the Commission has established to further regional cooperation in the different regions of the Union to support the development of energy infrastructure. And in the presentation now, I will first give a quick overview on what BEMIP is about, a bit of history, but then also focusing more on what is into it for offshore and specifically for grids, and what is coming in the near future and what we have achieved more recently. So let me start with a bit of history. So BEMIP was established in 2009, so it has a relatively long history compared to the other high-level groups, with a memorandum of understanding and an action plan at the time. And it brings together representatives from the ministries, from NRAs, and also TSOs and other stakeholders from the BEMIP region, from the member states around the Baltic Sea, as you can see here on the map, to work on the integration of the energy market in the region, and then more specifically also on energy infrastructure. And we had already a big projects, very important projects completed over the past more than 15 years, including, for example, electricity interconnectors like S-Link and others. And over time, the scope of BEMIP has been widened. You see in 2015, there was a new memorandum of understanding to extend the scope of BEMIP to touch on areas such as security of supply, energy efficiency, but also renewables, and then as one important topic, the synchronization of the Baltic system, electricity system, with the European power system. And the history has shown that the regional cooperation here is very effective, and this is why the next obvious step was then to look into the offshore angle that BEMIP could take. And on the next slide, you see that in 2019, we have completed a study that looked into the offshore potential of the Baltic Sea. And at the time, what the study concluded was that there is a potential of at least 93 gigawatt of offshore wind in the Baltic Sea by 2050. And the study looked also into approaches that would optimize the exploitation of this potential, looking into different examples of how hubs in connecting different countries in the region would help to use this potential in the most efficient way from an economic perspective, but also in view of the limited space and other uses of the sea to exploit it in a most efficient way. And this then led to, in 2020, which you see on the next slide, the signature of declaration of intent, specifically on offshore wind development in the Baltic Sea, and the establishment of an offshore wind working group, a dedicated working group with a dedicated work program to work towards exploiting this potential. And this working group brings together, again, as I mentioned earlier, representatives from ministries, from the NRAs, and also the TSOs, to work on different topics. And there are specifically 4 subtopics included in this work program, which is, first of all, a coordinated approach to grid planning. We then have the very important topic of maritime spatial planning to make sure that the space needed for offshore developments are also reflected in the MSPs. We then have a third important angle is then the financing aspect, how to make sure that concrete projects in the pipeline can secure the necessary financing, including then also on regulatory aspects for these projects. And then the fourth element is the acceleration of project implementation, which includes the important topic of permitting as well. So these are the 4 topics we're looking into this working group. So we have expanded the scope of BEMIP, used the successful regional cooperation in BEMIP for the offshore development, including on grids. And in the last couple of minutes of my introductory remarks, I would like to show how BEMIP helped to implement parts of our so-called 10E regulation. If you go to the next slide, for those not familiar, the 10E regulation is the regulatory framework for trans-European energy networks, so cross-border energy infrastructure of European added value that we help through this framework to implement as quickly as possible. And the revised 10E regulation that entered into force in 2022, so last year, sees or includes a strengthened focus on offshore grids to acknowledge that without offshore developments at a rapid scale, we won't be able to meet our climate and energy targets. And one element of these new provisions in the 10E regulation is that member states had to conclude non-binding agreements on offshore goals for the different sea basins by 2050, with intermediate targets for 2030 and 2040. And here, the BEMIP working group on offshore, which I mentioned earlier, was very instrumental helping developing these non-binding agreements, which were concluded in January this year, and for the first time brings together the offshore goals for the different sea basins, including for BEMIP. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what this means for BEMIP. So we have in 2030 an overall goal of 22 gigawatt, which increases to 35 gigawatt by 2040, and then 47 gigawatt by 2050. And on the next slide, you see the breakdown for the different countries in the region, including Latvia and Estonia, which I understand is the focus of one of the focus of the conference today. But I won't go into the details here on this table in view of time. I would just on the next slide explain in a couple of words what are the next steps, what happens with these non-binding agreements. And so E has started to work on the development of so-called high-level strategic integrated offshore network development plans, the ONDP, so offshore network development plans. We refer to it a bit more easy to remember than this quite lengthy term that some people came up with during the negotiations on the revision of the 10E regulation. So these ONDPs are under development. Again, with the involvement of the member states, TSOs, and other stakeholders, with the aim to provide a framework for decision makers on how to best develop future grid infrastructure in the different sea basins, to identify the needs for different types of infrastructure projects, hybrid projects, radial connections, but also needs for reinforcements on land to absorb the offshore generation that will be expected. And then also the implications for hydrogen infrastructure that derives from these offshore developments. And these plans will be available beginning of next year. This brings me then to the summary on my last slide on the next steps, which are indeed to well, you see the third bullet is what I just explained, these high-level strategic network development plans. But before that, early next year, we have now end of April, the BEMIP offshore working group will meet at technical level to discuss the next steps in this group. We will also have, or we have at the moment ongoing actually, the process to select the first union list of projects of common interest and projects of mutual interest, which the Commission will adopt in November this year, and which should then enter into force in early next year. And in this process, we're now looking at all the candidate projects submitted to receive the status. And one of the projects, as many of you may be familiar, is a hybrid offshore project between Latvia and Estonia, which is linked to the Elwind project, which is one of the projects to exploit the offshore potential in the region. Then we will have these offshore network development plans in early 2024, again with involvement of the BAMIP working group. In mid-2024, the Commission will publish guidance on cost-benefit and cost-sharing, which will then be applied to these ONDPs published in early 2024. And then end of next year, the next step will be the update of the non-binding agreements, which will be the moment for member states, if they wish so, to potentially increase their offshore goals as included in the agreements included in January, because some of the member states clearly indicated that due to ongoing discussions, including, for example, the revision of the NECPs or the updates of the National Energy and Climate Plans due later this year, they might then revise their targets upwards. So I would close here. I hope I managed to stick to the 7 minutes, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions then later in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. If technically it is possible and you can hear us, then it would be nice if you could stay for the next panel. How is the sound now?
Very good. The echo disappeared. Thanks you. Thanks.
Very good. Nice. All right. So let's then move on to our third panel of today's conference, Grid Me Up. It is going to be moderated by Giles Dixon from Wind Europe. Joining him, several panelists, Arnis Dauglis from Transmission System Operator in Latvia, Augstsprieguma tīkls. Member of the board in this organization. Preet Heinle, the head of offshore connection unit in Ellering. Anna Egmose Larsen, senior consultant in Energinet. And Wilfred van Bergen from IV, Offshore and Energy.
I hope you can all hear us at the back. Thank you to you, Raphael. I hope you can hear us, yes? Excellent. I think we should begin, ladies and gentlemen, by giving a round of applause to Raphael Sota for his excellent presentation. Great panel. Thank you very much for taking part in this. Now, I'm going to ask you in 2 minutes, each of you, to describe what your company is doing to build out offshore grids, especially in the Baltic. And Arnis, I'm going to start with you.
AST as a transmission system operator in Latvia, it's important to take a holistic view on the grid planning. So it's not only offshore, but also onshore, which keeps us busy. A quick update on what is going on onshore. The low-hanging fruits were mentioned in the morning. So Latvia introduced deposit payment for grid capacity reservation this year. Now we have low-hanging fruits in the amount of 4 gigawatts, which are backed up by deposit payments received from the developers. What it means in practice to pick these fruits, it's 33 projects new substations or reconstruction of the substations in 3 years. It will be a huge challenge for all involved, including TSOs, developers, design, construction companies, also the suppliers of equipment. But this is not the end of the story, because for now we already have 2.5 gigawatts of new requests for grid connection onshore, most of them solar, by the way. Now to your question about offshore, Elwind project has been mentioned a couple of times. In Latvia, this project is driven by Latvian Investment Development Agency. AST is taking part in this. We are providing grid expertise to this project. In parallel to that, we are working on the larger picture. There is a BOGI, Baltic Offshore Grid Initiative, where AST is working together with the other operators around the Baltic Sea. Intention is to create a long-term vision for the super grid in Baltic Sea. And in addition to this, we are working on bilateral contacts between operators, establishing new ones and re-establishing the existing ones. And I can mention two of those. One is with Swedish operator Svenska Kraftnät in the context of Latvia and Sweden interconnection. And the other one is with German operators looking already to the backbone of the super grid, connectivity between Baltics and Germany.
Thank you very much indeed, Arnis. Prit, tell us about Ellering and what you're doing.
Hi. Oh, can you hear?
We can.
Very good. Basically the same. Yeah, I guess that the TSOs are in a lot of aspects in the same boats. We also have this regime that's implemented this year in order to get rid of, so to say, phantom players on the market, that there would be more free capacity to connect into the grid. Then, of course, we are working on this holistic picture of looking at the grid from the perspective of the future supergrid in the sea. If we are talking about Elwind project, then the so to say the consultancy work that we are doing to make also the connection towards that, and so to say have a fourth connection between Estonia and Latvia, is something that we do on a regular basis. And we as Ellering are looking also to connect ourselves more thoroughly with Finland, meaning that Estlink 3 is something that definitely has the expectations from the grid already. We have congestion charges already on that interconnection, and there will be a third cable connecting us towards Finland. And I think that we must not forget that we are also doing the desynchronization, because those investments that are done for the desynchronization will also reinforce the grid so that it would be more resilient and will have more capacity to put whatever kind of energy into it. It's like a bypass of, not bypass, but a byproduct of the investments that are being made. And additionally, Ellering is investing in the grids that are more towards the south, because our historic production has been more towards the east, and with the resilience and recovery fund investment that we're receiving from Europe, then we are reinvesting into our existing grid so that there would be additional renewable capacities that are more towards the sea and that would relieve some of the pressure from the developers.
Yeah. Thank you. Anna, Energinet, the Danish electricity and gas TSO. You are doing offshore grids, of course, both in the North Sea and the Baltic. Tell us about your vision for the Baltic.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm from Energinet, the Danish TSO. Yeah, I would like to start with the purpose, with our main purpose is to ensure that we accelerate the green transition while we are upholding a security of supply and affordable energy prices for consumers. So we have that in mind. And of course, as you all know, we have a long tradition of near to shore wind in Denmark. But in order to harvest the full potential of wind, we are we are building out far from coast, and we're planning energy islands, both in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea. And we're doing that because we think that the energy islands have the potential to harvest the wind from far out from sea, and also connect to mainland from there. And I also bought this small piece of cable with me today, just to show what, in my perspective, is one of the most essential things for the green transition, and what this panel is all about, I guess. That we can harvest a lot of energy from far out from sea, and we can connect to each other. That's to our neighbors. That's the most important things. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna, and it's great to see the segment there of a cable. Now, you're planning to build an artificial island in the North Sea. In the Baltic, it's about using a natural island, or will you have an artificial island too in the Baltic?
Yeah, that's correct. The Baltic Sea is a bit special for Denmark. We don't have to construct the island. It's already there. So we are lucky that we can use the island to connect and yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, Wilfred, IV Offshore and Energy, Dutch company. Tell us what you're doing.
Yeah, that's correct, a Dutch company. We are a design and engineering company. We work with a specialty on topsides, so that we have a history in the oil and gas. And the most recent things that we have done with regard to grid connection is that for TenneT in 2020 and 2021, we developed their 2 gigawatt standard topside that they are now, as you follow the news probably have seen, buying in great numbers. So they recently, last week, announced a 23 billion euros investment on several of these big topsides to be built up to 2031, I believe, that the last one should come online. Next to that, we are at the moment involved in the Baltic with the Oswin 3, the Gennica 1 and the Gennica 2 topsides as well. And for myself, previously, I worked on the Kriegers Flak, when that had a combined grid solution, being the first ever interconnector between 2 countries, being Denmark and Germany. So that was a for Energinet. And for the future, I think the most important thing is what we are doing now is the development on hydrogen offshore production and hydrogen storage offshore, as well as electrifying the existing oil and gas platforms, where we have a new one in development that doesn't have any, let's say, emissions, because it's directly connected to an offshore wind farm. So it takes its power from there. And of course, the 2 gigawatt topside will be further developed, because now it's a very simple interconnector, and they want to go to an interconnector 2.0, being part of a smart grid. And that means that that topside has to be adjusted to fit that kind of equipment, and that equipment also has to be developed, because it's not there for it yet.
Thank you, Wilfred. This sounds really big. What TenneT, the Dutch TSO, are going to announce tomorrow. 23 billion euros of contracts, you say, with the 3 substation manufacturers, yeah?
Yeah, they have announced 3. Yeah, that's already announced. They have placed orders for 23 billion euros in total for, I believe, 11 that have been allocated to 3 different consortia. Yes.
Okay. And the idea is to encourage the 3 substation manufacturers to invest in manufacturing capacity, so that they and Europe collectively will have more factories making the substations that TenneT are going to need and the other TSOs are going to need. Is that right?
They are planning on having these on order to meet the very high ambitions, but that also means it puts a lot of stress on the total supply chain, for sure. It will increase the amount for transformers, GISs, but also all the auxiliary equipment that goes along with it. So yes, it's big. It's very big, and it also should encourage different TSOs to look at what TenneT is doing, and also what Amprion is doing as well, to see, okay, you have to make these steps to make sure that it actually happens. That's what I applaud TenneT for, to actually make it happen. They place the orders. It's no longer an ambition. It's now a project in execution.
You say pressure on the supply chain. The 3 European substation manufacturers today can only make 5 substations a year between them. And they need very soon to be making 20 a year between them. You say pressure, but at least you're giving them the backing of this framework agreement. They know the orders are coming in, so they build new factories, yeah?
Yeah, and I also know for one, I cannot name which one, that is looking to reinstate an old yard, because they know there is so much in the pipeline.
This is a pretty good model. What do the rest of you think? Will you sign similar supply agreements with the manufacturers? Preet.
I guess that it would be the double size of the Estonian state budget if it would be the 23 billion. But my question also would be actually to add here, is the 23 billion enough to encourage the whole supply chain? If we're talking about one TSO making this kind of investment, maybe it should be a bunch of TSOs making this kind of a combined effort. And then we go basically into technical standardization. If, you know, one TSO has one set of needs, the other TSO has the other set of needs, you couldn't have this combination. It could be theorized in order to have these incentives in Europe that there should be common standardization that is throughout these kinds of technologies, and that these investments that are also incentives could be even bigger. So if Elering would be a part of that, if we would have an investment, let's say we would not be the driver, definitely. Mm-hmm. Those investments are too big for our small TSO. But to be some kind of a part, to be in that community that is incentivizing, but maybe having one substation from the bunch, that would be something that would be beneficial, definitely. Cannot give any guarantees, but it seems to be a good idea.
Yeah. Wilfried, you say Amprion, the German TSO, are following a similar model to TenneT, yeah?
Yeah, that's correct. They also have already at least purchased 2 of them for now. Also 2 of these big 2 gigawatt stations.
Yeah, okay. Arnis, Anna, how do you see the supply chain? Anna.
Yeah, we see a lot of pressure, and that's why we also work for standardization across Europe, and we work for cooperation, and we need to connect to each other, to cooperate, and not to only to compete with each other. Then we'll all lose in some way. But we need to get together, I guess.
Yeah, Arnis.
Yeah, from AST side, we also see it as a huge pressure. Not even talking about the offshore, also the onshore projects, for example, transformers. The lead time for supply of transformers is now already up to 2 years. And there are no signs that it is getting better. And with all these projects happening in the whole region, we expect that it will only get worse, and the prices will continue to go up. So hard times for TSOs.
Sure. That cable, show it to us again, Anna, please. So this is not just about the transformer substation manufacturers, it's the cable manufacturers as well. Today in Europe, the factories making cables can make 1,200 kilometers a year of that. They need to be making 2,300 kilometers a year of that. So not only do we need more substation factories, we need more cable factories. And we don't want to be importing this from outside of Europe, do we? Arnis? Anna? Preet?
We had a small section of offshore cable that we were purchasing last year for, let's say, that was less than a kilometer, and even then we wouldn't allow Chinese cables into our system just because of the unproven reliability, and let's say the world is definitely more polarized than it has been 1 year, 3 months ago. Yeah, so it's getting more polarized. At the same time, the question is that we're also hearing that the other TSOs are making these big investments into the cables also, that are making these big purchases of cables. Is this incentivizing enough for the cable factories that they will have new factories starting from 2026 or whenever they are starting? If you're saying that 2,300 kilometers is needed at the moment, but what about 2030? Do we need 10,000 kilometers then? Because the ambitions are going higher and higher, and it seems from a TSO perspective with these cables, with these transformers, that the manufacturers are not picking it up at the moment. They are making good profits, but not picking up on the incentive. Maybe they are thinking that maybe this will pass, but from the investments that are planned by the developers to Estonia solely could cover those 2,000 kilometers a year for some years. So, and we are almost the smallest market in EU. So the other markets are probably massively overbooked.
So the 2,000 kilometers a year of Anna's cable that we need in Europe to be making, that's for 2030. And the cable manufacturers say, so long as there's a clear, visible project pipeline, they will invest in the additional industrial capacity. And that's what the substation manufacturers say as well. Now, are there any other comments on the supply chain before we move on to the model for the grid in the Baltic?
Maybe from the supply chain point of view, what we see is that there is definitely a little bit bigger of a gap between Central Europe and, let's say, the Baltic area, because there hasn't been an offshore culture in constructing offshore assets here. So we see that the harbors are a little bit further maybe than they have been in Denmark, in Norway, in Germany, in the Netherlands, because there is a history of building something offshore. Here, if we just talk to the harbor owners, then they maybe don't see the potential, and if they see the potential, then they see that it's a massive investment, so also the incentives are needed there. Not our job, it's job for the state, but but still we see that the harbor investments are quite massive also that need to be done. There are some harbors that we also are trying to understand what they are doing, and that they are thinking towards wind. There's Baltic Sea harbor that is doing some investments to have bigger laydown areas and so on. But it should be also a little bit better coordinated between the harbor owners of all the Baltic states, for example.
The harbours across Europe need to invest 9 billion euros in port infrastructure capacity by 2030 just for offshore wind. It's space to lie down the equipment, it's the heavy loading quaysides, the deep berths for the jack-up vessels. Some countries are using their recovery and resilience money like you're using it in Estonia for grid infrastructure. Some are using their post-COVID money for port infrastructure as well. Okay, let's talk about the model for the grid in the Baltic. Now, Europe has 30 gigawatts of offshore wind today. All of it, with the exception of one wind farm, is connected to the mother country with one single point-to-point radial grid connection. That exception happens to be in the Baltic. Kriegers Flak, with its connection to Denmark and to Germany. Now, Elwind is going to be another such hybrid offshore wind farm. How do you all see the relative importance of hybrid formats versus traditional point-to-point formats? There'll be a bit of both, of course, going forward, but what's the relative importance of the two? Who'd like to go first on this? Go on, Arnis.
Okay, I wouldn't put it as a mutually exclusive thing.
Not at all.
But especially if we talk about the super grid in the future, then definitely it is a hybrid model. And I'd like to look at it as a jigsaw. You have to have a long-term vision in your mind, but then you make this jigsaw piece by piece. For example, Elwind, you see that this fits in the one part of the jigsaw. Latvian Swedish interconnection, other one, Kriegers Flak, another one, and so it step by step is being built into something which is called the super grid, the Baltic offshore grid. And there's also a place for radially connected parks here, but it's a matter of time. For example, now it's radially connected. When the supergrid comes into reality, it can be connected to the supergrid. So it's not mutually exclusive. But the thing here is the tricky part of it is how to plan these near projects wisely so that they fit into the future model easily. And that would need something like something called anticipatory investments, that we are prepared to pay a little bit more in the initial projects, but providing a future expandability to the project.
Thank you. Preet, Anna.
Yeah, I think that from the perspective of how does it fit in, I guess Kriegers Flak also isn't an offshore bidding zone yet. It's also connected to one market area.
Correct.
Yeah, so it's a little bit, let's say the technicality has been proven there, then it's the question of how the market actually works. And that actually then ties into what Arnius was saying, that we need to have, let's say, the puzzle pieces. Kriegers Flak is the first puzzle piece. There are different puzzle pieces coming in, but at the same time, the holistic view, I guess that from the regulatory point of view, hasn't had its first puzzle piece tested out. And thus, a little bit hard to say how this connects all together. Everybody is pro-production, everybody is pro-interconnections, but they also fight between one another a bit. So the regulatory framework needs updating or tweeting or something like this. But I guess that it's also an ongoing, a long discussion. Maybe how to solve this is to have, I don't know, like a test bed that actually would work as an offshore bidding zone, and then actually that could establish a better business case for this. And of course, the incentive that Europe has given that the technology makers should be interoperable by 2028, if I'm correct. So I guess that those things, some things are already in place, but maybe a test bed would be needed in order to develop the business case.
You've really put your finger on something there, Preet, the regulatory framework. Raphael, after Anna has spoken, I'm going to give you the floor to say something about this fantastic new transmission access guarantee that the Commission have proposed as part of the market design measures, which I think is the answer to the question that Preet has just identified. Anna.
I would just support that a combination of the point-to-point and the hybrid connections, that's what we need. And the hybrid is it's beneficial for us to go far out at sea, as what we need, as we see to harvest the full potential, and that's what we are going after, I think. Yeah.
Wilfried, as a technology provider, any views from you on the relative merits and weight of these two models, both of which will feature, of course, point-to-point and hybrid?
I'm totally for the hybrid solution, especially if you are producing a lot of energy, for example, Estonia and Latvia, and you're not using it to transfer that to a different market. That's why I firmly believe that the offshore grid should be in hands of the TSOs. Just to make a remark for you.
Thank you for that. Raphael, tell us about the transmission access guarantee.
Sure. If I may add one additional comment, I mean, because the previous speaker was also referring to the importance of the grid planning. If we look which model to choose, whether radials or hybrid, it's then again the question of how to bring in a forward-looking manner the different bits together, and also in view of the anticipatory investment that was mentioned. I think the offshore network development plans we're currently working on should hopefully also make a contribution to give more clarity into which models we should invest to make things happen in a most efficient way. And one element is then, of course, the regulatory framework, which many speakers have touched upon. And indeed, there is quite some uncertainty, in particular for specific projects, because every project is different, the situation is different, and this is why it's important to bring the different participants together to discuss it in concrete terms, what these means. And I mean, I'm working also a lot with the North Seas Energy Corporation, for example, on the North Sea side, NSEC, and then we have now BEMIP, the working group, where we can bring project promoters also together to discuss this in more concrete terms, I think, which is extremely useful. And then let me answer the question on the transmission access guarantee. This is indeed one element in the proposal the Commission made a couple of weeks ago on the electricity market design to de-risk investments, as was mentioned earlier, with an offshore bidding zone where project promoters are exposed to a high level of uncertainty in terms of access to the transmission network. And this transmission access guarantee is aimed to address this uncertainty by compensating the promoters adequately. And I think overall, this seems to be well received when we look at our feedback also when preparing the proposal. But of course, it's also important to then address some of the concerns in relation to potential overcompensation or others, I think, that some stakeholders mentioned.
Thank you, Raphael. Indeed, your transmission access guarantee proposal has been extremely well received. Now, Wilfried, a few moments ago, you said something that some people might think is a bit controversial. You said whatever the model is, point-to-point or hybrid, it must be the TSOs doing it. And I read into that only the TSOs. Do you wish to elaborate? And I'm going to ask the other three of you, do you agree with that? Could you foresee instances in which other economic actors could come in and make the necessary investments in grid infrastructure?
I think but that's a personal opinion, the grid infrastructure offshore should be with the TSOs once you start combining or distributing the electrical power between nations. I think that should be a government-regulated thing. That does not. I don't think the TSO should be the developer and exploiter. Then it's good that that's with the commercial parties like the Vattenfalls and Ørsteds and RWEs, etc. But the actual grid connection, I think that belongs with the TSO. It's critical infrastructure. It's a national importance. It's European importance. And once we get that grid connected, and I know that will take 20 plus more years to develop it. Technically, it will be quite some challenges to be overcome, but it's also for our own independence as Europe, as Europeans, to make sure that we have this grid locked in and independent and self-sufficient for Europe.
Thank you. Anna, Denmark is a champion of free markets. Could other economic actors come into the grid infrastructure space?
It's maybe a rather political question, but I guess we are glad that we have a model where we have a TSO that owns the grid infrastructure and control it, as you say. But we are also aware that we need the cooperation with the market company, with the companies, and the competition and innovation and all that. And that's why we own the grid and we make it work. But we have competition as well, so we have a combination.
Okay, thank you. Preet, Arnes, any thoughts?
But we already have a possibility that somebody else can own some grid assets, is that when a connecting party is constructing their own connection. But in a way, that's not the transmission grid. Our view Engineering definitely is that we should own the transmission grid because of the responsibility that anyways is given to us. Otherwise, just sharing a responsibility with other market players would be difficult at best. It's really would be very cumbersome to share the responsibility of the technical existence of the grid with somebody else. And it is something that, for example, if we have the offshore connections at the moment that are just point-to-point, not hybrids with Finland, then we share the responsibility by giving it to one another on half-year basis. We are not sharing it longitudinally. We just say half year it's yours, half year it's mine. Whoever screws up something, then it's their responsibility. But if there isn't a situation in the grid where we would have, let's say, an ownership that is not ours. Yeah.
Thank you, Arnis.
Yeah, I agree to that. If we talk about hybrid infrastructure, then it has to be owned and operated by TSOs. I have one comment about this transmission access guarantee proposal. It has not been so well received by ENTSO-E, which is a European Association of Transmission System Operators, because of several reasons. First, well, maybe to explain what it actually means. It means that TSO use their congestion income in order to compensate offshore developers if they do not have access to the grid. We don't like the idea because first it discriminates onshore developers. Second, it is related with additional financial risks to transmission system operators. And the third, it kind of jeopardizes the very intention of how the congestion income is used. Normally, it is used for solving the congestion situations, and this is not the right way how to use the congestion income in our opinion. So we stand by the hesitant or opposing position from ENTSO-E in this relation.
But your congestion income will go up with these new models, and if the proposal is simply that you share your additional congestion income so that all the parties who need to invest in these hybrids have a business case for doing so, that is not unfair, is it?
I wouldn't like to go more into details into this. I just wanted to state that this is still something which requires additional debate.
Understood. Okay, now, Arnis, Preet, Anna, the three of your companies and every other TSO in Europe needs to invest billions in offshore grid infrastructure. Are you satisfied that the business models, the incentives are in place to support the investments that your companies need to make?
I guess that the elephant in the room for the developers is also where is the money coming from. So in that kind of a way for the grid developments also it's the same question. The Baltics use a deep charging regime for whomever is connecting into the grid, and so a connecting party is paying for all the reinforcements that are done also not only close to the connection point but also in the grid. So the question is if we are not giving that cost to the developer but are socializing it, this regime has never happened. There hasn't been a situation, at least in the Estonian grid, where a new 330 kV line would be built because of a connecting party and that it would be socialized. So we are, let's say, the Estonia-Latvia fourth interconnector is something that is basically testing this system out, that we are making another interconnection that is very heavily leaning towards A, having a better connection with our neighbors, of course, but B, also then taking some of the cost risk out from the developers. So for us, we are, let's say, we are not satisfied at the moment because an FID hasn't been done, but that takes some time. But we are satisfied with how the things are, or where the things are heading.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. And I'm going to ask the $60 question. You've been talking for the last hour nearly just about electricity transmission from all these offshore wind farms. What about transmitting this energy as molecules? What's the relative importance going to be of hydrogen in this equation of how we get the energy from offshore wind farms to energy consumers? Anna, Energinet's both a gas TSO and electricity TSO. You'll have some thoughts on this.
I can speak as on the behalf of gas and electricity. That's right, but not the. We are still waiting to see if we can speak about hydrogen. But we see big potential in that as well, of course, and also in connection with the energy islands. Yeah.
So you mean putting both electrolyzers on these islands as well as the substations?
Onshore, offshore, or yeah. It will depend on the market. Yeah.
Okay, Arnis.
Yeah, as an answer to your question, I want to emphasize the message which is given by the previous panel, that we shouldn't think only about export, but we should think also about how to use this cheap electricity produced by the renewables for local consumption. And here, technologies like power-to-X, hydrogen, electrification, in one word, is very important. If the ambition of the renewables stay at the current level and consumption in Baltic countries continues to stagnate, there will be curtailments, and nobody wants it.
But your electricity consumption is going to grow with electrification.
That's what electrification is meant for, yes?
Yeah. Wilfred, do you have a view on this, the role of hydrogen as a technology provider?
We have already been involved in the first pilots that are going on the North Sea. It will be a part of the energy transition and a part of the energy mix in the future, especially with regard to storage, because storage of electricity remains a very difficult issue, and hydrogen can be a part of it, will be a part of it, but in which case and which way it will be used, that's still very much in the future. I don't also have a crystal ball, but it will be there for sure.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our excellent panel, and then Oscars, we yield back to you.